When a woman discovered her husband's betrayal with a glamorous millionaire, her heartbreak turned into cold determination. Instead of crumbling, she crafted a plan so shocking it left everyone stunned. Her revenge? Marrying the one person they never saw coming, the millionaire's own father, and cutting them off from the inheritance entirely. Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any inspiring stories I share. The evening air was cool, the kind that hinted at autumn's arrival, but Grace barely noticed as she stepped out of her car and onto the driveway. Her day had been draining, back-to-back meetings and a litany of emails that demanded responses, but she pushed through it all, thinking of the comfort of home. Jonathan's text earlier had been brief: "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up." She'd sighed but accepted it, as she often did, chalking it up to his busy workload. Lately, he seemed to have more excuses than ever, but Grace told herself it was just a phase. Tonight, though, something felt off. She hadn't planned to come home so early. An event at her firm had wrapped up sooner than expected, but as she unlocked the door, the strange silence struck her immediately. The house was dark except for the dim glow coming from the hallway leading to the bedroom. Jonathan never left the lights on unless he was home. "Jonathan," she called out, her voice echoing faintly. There was no response. Stepping inside, Grace was hit by a faint but unmistakable scent: jasmine. It wasn't hers. She frowned, closing the door behind her and setting down her bag. Then she saw it: Jonathan's tie, his favorite navy silk tie, draped carelessly over the edge of the entry table. Her heart skipped a beat. "Jonathan," she called again, louder this time, but still no answer came. Her eyes scanned the room as she moved further into the house, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. A blouse caught her attention next, delicate, sheer, and decidedly not hers, lying crumpled on the stairs. Her stomach turned, dread coiling in her chest like a viper. Piece by piece, she followed the trail. His belt lay discarded at the top of the stairs, next to a pair of pants. She didn't recognize the brand, but the slim fit and bright color screamed youth. Too young for Jonathan, too careless for a woman her age. Grace swallowed hard, her throat tight as she approached the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, the faint hum of low voices drifting out. She pushed it open. The scene inside hit her like a slap. Jonathan was sprawled across the bed, shirtless, his body tangled with that of another woman. Madison Lancaster. Her golden hair spilled across Grace's pillow, her laughter soft and intoxicating. They hadn't noticed her yet, too caught up in their own world, too wrapped in each other to care about anything else. For a moment, Grace couldn't move. Her heart raced, her breath shallow as she processed what was in front of her. Her husband, in their bed, with her. It was Madison who saw her first. She froze, her eyes widening in horror as her laughter died in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered, clutching the sheet to her chest. "Jonathan, someone's here." Jonathan turned his head lazily, a smug grin on his face that instantly vanished when he saw Grace standing in the doorway. He shot upright, scrambling to cover himself. "Grace. This isn't what it looks like." "Don't," Grace cut him off, her voice low and steady. She didn't scream, didn't cry. The storm inside her brewed quietly, contained behind her icy exterior. "I'll deal with you later." Turning on her heel, Grace left the room, ignoring Jonathan's shouts of her name. She moved quickly but not hurriedly, her heels striking the floor like gunshots as she descended the stairs. Once outside, she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The pain was sharp, deep, and undeniable, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Instead, a calm, cold determination settled over her. Jonathan and Madison thought they could betray her and get away with it. They were wrong. So very, very wrong. Grace drove off into the night, her mind already racing with plans. Through her windshield, her mind churned, replaying the scene she'd stumbled upon in their bedroom. Jonathan's smirk, Madison's wide, guilty eyes, and the laughter that had haunted her even as she stormed out. Betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, but Grace wasn't one to crumble under its weight. Jonathan and Madison had underestimated her. They'd seen her as the dutiful wife, the woman who smiled politely at dinner parties and managed the mundane logistics of their lives. What they didn't realize was that Grace was more than capable of playing their game and winning. The first step was gathering information. She started with Madison. Late that night, Grace sat at her kitchen table, her laptop glowing in the dark. A quick internet search confirmed what she already knew. Madison was the spoiled daughter of Richard Lancaster, a steel magnate whose name was synonymous with wealth and influence. Articles described him as a widower who built an empire from the ground up, a man revered for his business acumen and respected for his philanthropy. Madison, in contrast, was painted as a socialite, young, beautiful, and carelessly extravagant. But beneath the headlines, Grace unearthed the details that mattered. Richard wasn't just a distant figure. He was involved in his daughter's life, his fortune directly tied to hers. And from what Grace could gather, he wasn't the type to tolerate disloyalty. The realization crystallized her plan. If she could win over Richard, she wouldn't just destroy Jonathan and Madison's relationship, she'd dismantle their future. The opportunity presented itself 3 weeks later at a charity gala for children's education. Grace had learned through her research that Richard was a major donor and a frequent attendee of such events. She secured an invitation through her connections at work, opting for a crimson dress that hugged her figure and accentuated her porcelain complexion. The room was buzzing with laughter and polite conversation when Grace spotted him. Richard stood near the bar, his silver hair catching the light as he spoke to another guest. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who knew his power but didn't flaunt it. Grace approached the bar, timing her arrival perfectly as the guest he was speaking with excused themselves. She ordered a glass of wine and turned to him with a warm smile. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice steady and confident. "Your speech earlier was inspiring. I didn't realize the extent of your involvement in this charity." He glanced at her, his sharp blue eyes assessing but not unkind. "Thank you," he replied, extending a hand. "And you are?" "Grace," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "Grace Harlow." They fell into easy conversation, Grace steering the topic toward his work and philanthropic efforts. She listened intently, nodding at the right moments and asking thoughtful questions. Richard seemed genuinely impressed, his posture relaxing as the evening wore on. By the end of the night, she'd secured his attention. "You're an interesting woman, Grace," he said, handing her a card. "I'd like to continue this conversation sometime. Call me." Their first official meeting was over lunch at a quiet, upscale restaurant. Richard was charming but reserved, his words deliberate as if weighing their impact. Grace matched his energy, careful not to seem overeager while subtly revealing glimpses of her wit and intellect. Their lunches turned into dinners, and soon, Richard was inviting her to his estate, a sprawling property that exuded both opulence and warmth. Grace found herself genuinely enjoying his company. He was nothing like Jonathan. Where Jonathan had been brash and careless, Richard was thoughtful and deliberate. One evening, over a glass of bourbon by his fireplace, Richard opened up about his past. "My marriage ended badly," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "Madison's mother, she was unfaithful. It broke something in me, and it broke Madison too. She hasn't been the same since." Grace listened quietly, her heart twisting at the pain in his voice. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Richard shook his head. "It's in the past, but it shaped us both. Madison swore she'd never do to anyone what her mother did to us. She's spirited, but deep down she's a good girl." Grace felt a pang of guilt. Her initial intentions now felt shallow in the face of Richard's vulnerability. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. When Richard proposed weeks later, it wasn't the culmination of her plan, it was something more. Grace realized she wasn't just acting anymore. She'd fallen for him, truly and deeply. "I love you," Richard said as he slid the ring onto her finger, his voice steady and sure. "I love you too," Grace whispered, and for the first time in weeks, she meant it. The restaurant was a picture of elegance. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a soft golden light, and the quiet hum of refined conversation added an air of exclusivity. Grace had spared no detail in planning the evening. The table was set for 6, draped in white linen and adorned with delicate floral arrangements, their soft pink hues a perfect complement to the gold-rimmed dinnerware. The occasion was clear from the outset. This wasn't just any dinner. This was the night Grace would announce her engagement to Richard Lancaster, sealing the bond that had grown stronger with every passing day. Richard arrived first, punctual as always. His tailored suit emphasized his broad shoulders, and the warmth in his blue eyes softened his otherwise commanding presence. He kissed Grace's cheek and whispered, "You look stunning." "Thank you," she replied, her lips curving into a smile. Her white dress, understated yet elegant, hugged her figure perfectly, the engagement ring on her finger catching the light as she adjusted her wineglass. Minutes later, the other guests arrived. Jonathan and Madison walked in together, their faces a mask of strained politeness. Jonathan's tie was slightly askew, and Madison's usual confident stride faltered as she took in the grandeur of the restaurant. Grace had chosen this venue deliberately, knowing its sophistication would unnerve them. "Grace," Jonathan said stiffly, his tone laced with unease. "Thanks for the invite." "Jonathan," she replied with a measured smile, her voice cool. "Madison. I'm so glad you could join us." Madison avoided her gaze, her fingers gripping Jonathan's arm a little too tightly. They were barely seated when Richard leaned forward, his expression bright. "Before we get started, I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. This is a special evening, and Grace and I have an announcement to make." Jonathan's brow furrowed, and Madison's eyes darted between Grace and her father. Richard reached for Grace's hand, his voice steady as he continued, "Grace and I are engaged." The words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of them settling over the table like a heavy blanket. Jonathan stiffened, his jaw tightening, while Madison's face drained of color. "You're engaged," Madison said, her voice rising slightly, disbelief etched into every syllable. "That's right," Richard replied, his tone calm but firm. "Grace has brought so much light into my life. She's strong, intelligent, and compassionate, the perfect partner." Grace felt Jonathan's gaze burning into her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her attention to the champagne flute in her hand, the faintest smile playing on her lips. Madison's shock gave way to anger. "And what does this mean for the inheritance?" she blurted, her voice tinged with desperation. "You're giving it all to her?" Richard's expression darkened. "Grace will inherit everything once we're married, yes," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Madison shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "You can't be serious. She's manipulating you. Don't you see? She's only doing this because Jonathan cheated on her with me." The room went silent. All eyes turned to Grace. Grace placed her glass down carefully, meeting Madison's furious gaze. "You're right," she said evenly. "Jonathan did cheat on me. And yes, that betrayal hurt me more than I can put into words. But what you're wrong about is my intentions with Richard." She turned to Richard, her voice softening. "Richard, I won't lie to you. When I first met you, it wasn't entirely by chance. I sought you out because I wanted revenge on Jonathan and Madison for what they did to me. But somewhere along the way, that stopped mattering. What matters to me now is you." Richard studied her, his sharp blue eyes searching hers for any trace of deceit. Grace held his gaze, her heart pounding. Finally, he spoke. "I believe you," he said, his voice steady. He turned to Madison, his expression hardening. "But you, Madison, you swore you'd never hurt anyone the way your mother hurt us. And yet, here we are." Madison's face crumpled. "Dad, Enough," Richard cut her off. "You've made your choices. And so have I." Madison stormed out, tears streaking her face, while Jonathan hesitated, looking back at Grace one last time. She didn't acknowledge him, her focus solely on Richard. Richard sighed, his hand covering hers. "I'm sorry about that. But I'm glad you told me the truth." Grace smiled, squeezing his hand. "I meant every word." The dinner continued, the air lighter now, as if a storm had passed. Jonathan wasn't as lucky. Word of the dinner confrontation had spread, tarnishing his reputation among their mutual friends and professional acquaintances. His humiliation was complete when Madison, cut off from her father's wealth, ended their relationship in a fiery argument at her apartment. Grace heard about the breakup through a mutual acquaintance, who recounted the scene with barely concealed glee. Madison had thrown Jonathan's clothes out the window, screaming about how he'd ruined everything. Jonathan had left the scene red-faced, with nothing but a duffel bag and the shattered remains of his pride. Grace didn't pity him. Months later, Grace and Richard stood hand in hand at another gala, this one held at his estate. The event was a celebration of a new philanthropic initiative they launched together, blending Richard's resources with Grace's sharp instincts and organizational skills. As the evening progressed, several guests approached Grace, offering congratulations and compliments. She smiled graciously, handling the attention with ease. When the night finally drew to a close, Richard pulled her aside, his expression tender. "You've been incredible tonight," he said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd survive," she teased lightly, "but it wouldn't be as fun." They both laughed, their voices mingling with the soft hum of crickets in the garden. For the first time in years, Grace felt whole. She hadn't just survived betrayal, she'd risen above it, reclaiming her dignity and forging a new path. And as she stood beside Richard, her hand in his, she knew she had truly won. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm sure you'll also love the next one. Click on the video on the screen right now, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching until the end. See you soon.